Next session, I would like to invite our chairperson, Dr. Harsh Kumar, Dr. Jyotirmay Biswas, Dr. Tuli Devan. I request all the chairpersons to please unmute their mic and switch on their camera. Thank you so much. Over to the chairpersons.
So welcome to the session 2, that is the glaucoma, yoga and the neuro-ophthalm session. Welcome to the chairpersons. So would you like to say something about the session before we begin with our first speaker?
I think the basic idea of the session is to be able to give to the postgraduates some key words, and we are very lucky to have very good speakers, so they can pass on the messages to the AOS members who are also mostly postgraduates in this sessions, for whom we have conducted these sessions. Dr. Biswas, welcome, and would you like to say something, please?
No, I think it would be a very good session for the resident, and they is aimed for the resident, and keep the talks very simple, so that the postgraduates can benefit by just like.
Hi, good morning, Harsh sir. Good morning.
Welcome to Lee. How are you?
Hi, sir. Please carry on.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
So I'm in clinic, sir. I am in clinic, so I'll just keep.
Yeah. You told me so. So please go ahead, do your work. We'll catch you if we need you.
Yeah. And hello to all the glaucoma speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Dr. Manish will be grateful if we can start.
Sure, sir.
Thing is the optic disc in evaluation of glaucoma, because that is what everybody can see just with the help of a simple ophthalmoscope, and you must see what a lot of people are missing. So we have our rising star of the Northeast, Dr. Manish, who will illuminate you upon this. Go ahead, Manish.
So a little something about Dr. Manish Singh. So he's a brilliant academician, and he started his career at Shankara Nethralaya, and he is proficient in all types of glaucoma surgeries and cataract surgeries, and he has special interest in pediatric glaucoma as well. And so over to you, sir.
Rolika, 1 minute. Do we have any questions which will come in, or what is the pattern?
So the questions will pop up. So after every session, we'll take 1 or 2 minutes for the chairpersons to have a discussion instead of taking it in the end. And if any of the questions come up, we'll discuss it during that time.
Right. So after the glaucoma session, I'll be leaving and Jyoti will take over. I'll already discussed because I have.
Ji, sir.
Okay.
Ji, sir. So let's begin with our first session.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Respected chairpersons, really a pleasure and honor to be part of this program, and thank you, Dr. Rolika, for such a generous introduction. So I'll be speaking on optic disc evaluation, as Dr. Harsh sir was mentioning. It's a very, very vital topic for glaucoma practitioners, for every student. You know, in a glaucoma evaluation, there are certain key points. For example, intraocular pressure, which is extremely vital for the treatment. Your gonioscopy is extremely vital because you need to classify your patients into open angle, closed angle, and understanding the etiology of glaucoma. Visual fields are important for assessing the grade of glaucoma, understanding the rate of progression of glaucoma. But I personally believe that disc evaluation is the most important evaluation in glaucoma, because after all, glaucoma is a disease of the optic nerve. And how well you evaluate your optic nerve determines how good a glaucoma expert you are. So disc evaluation, I believe, is the X factor in glaucoma evaluation. In my presentation of 14-15 minutes, I'll be talking about the key disc findings which are important for glaucoma. I'll also discuss the 5 R's, which you all know, which has been introduced by Professor Vainrup, and we'll share some example to understand how disc evaluation is done. So as I was mentioning, the most important thing in glaucoma is disc evaluation, and disc and field correlation is vital for glaucoma diagnosis. So whenever you see a disc, the point we need to see is that, is there any thinning of the neuroretinal rim? Is there any RNFL thinning which is there, which we need to locate and we need to document? So you can see in this patient, you can see the polar notching, the superior, inferior, the neuroretinal rim has become thin. There are certain common findings which we see in optic disc, which we should be aware of. For example, the bayonetic sign, which is a sharp 90-degree turning of the optic vessels when the cup increases in size. In this case, you can see the neuroretinal rim has become thin. You can see the nasalization of central vessels. You can see the presence of disc hemorrhage. So all these findings we need to actively look for in a patient with glaucoma. Again, the bearing of circumlinear vessels, where you can see that the blood vessel is basically hanging in the cup because of thinning of the neuroretinal rim. The tissue, you can see a pallor and both sides of the blood vessel, which is indicating that this area there is a loss of neuroretinal rim. This is another patient with a bayoneting sign. Lamellar dot sign again is very important. As there is loss of retinal ganglion cells, the pores of lamella cribrosa increase in size. They become more prominent, and which is what we call as the lamellar dot sign. We'll come to the 5 R's, which has been first introduced by Dr. Fingret and Dr. Wainwright, which are extremely useful for a complete evaluation of optic disc. Starting with first, that is the scleral ring size. So we need to determine the size of the optic disc, what we call as the scleral ring. We need to see the neuroretinal rim. We need to actually see which area the rim is thinned out. Also look for the retinal nerve fiber layers. Look for the region of parapapillary atrophy. We'll come to it in detail later on. Also look for retinal and optic disc hemorrhage. So these 5 things we should try to actively search in every patient where we are suspecting glaucoma. In fact, in every patient who walks into your OPD. Starting with the scleral ring, optic discs, they can come in all sizes. All these 3 discs are actually normal. The problem with us is that because we are so much biased looking at the cup, in a patient with large disc, we tend to overdiagnose glaucoma. And in patient with a smaller disc like this, we often miss early glaucoma changes because we are very much influenced by the size of the cup. So we need to classify patient into large and small discs. Also, we need to understand that optic disc is like a canal through which the optic nerve fibers pass. So the amount of fiber is same, whether it's a small disc or the large disc. And since it's the same amount of fiber in a small and large disc, in a small disc, you see crowding with a small cup. And in large disc, the fibers are spread around the margin and you see a large cup. So that is why small disc have small cups and large disc will have a large cup. But as I was telling you, whenever you see a small disc, you should be extra careful because these type of subtle changes, a minor inferior rim thinning, these type of things you may miss in a small disc. And a large disc, again, we have to see the neuroretinal rim, but always understand in a large disc, a large cupping is mostly normal. Now, how to understand the disc size? Classically, we have been taught that a small aperture, that is the 5 degree of Welch-Allyn direct ophthalmoscope, correspond to the normal disc size. So in case you're using that, you can use it to understand whether the disc size is normal. Above it will be a large, smaller will be a smaller disc size. What is more practical now, because now most of us are using slit lamp and we use high plus lenses, you can actually measure the size of the disc using a narrow slit beam. And using these correction factors, depending on what lens you're using. For example, suppose I use a 90D lens. So I can multiply by 1.3 and I can get an idea what is the average size of the disc. As the time passes and you're seeing disc regularly, by experience, you can say this is a smaller disc, this is a large disc. Actual measurement may not be required in every patient, but an overview that, okay, I'm dealing with a larger disc, so a large cup is normal, or I'm dealing with a smaller disc, I need to be extra careful, look beyond the cup, try to see subtle changes of glaucoma will be important. Now coming to the second rule, identify the neuroretinal rim. In current glaucoma practice, the neuroretinal rim is more important than the cup. We have to see whether there is any tearing, any excavation in the neuroretinal rim. We are aware about the ISNT rule. In a normal disc, the inferior rim is thicker than the superior, than the nasal and the temporal rim. But we have to understand almost 25 to 30% of our patients do not follow the ISNT rule. We have to look for any rim thinning. A notching basically is the area where the neuroretinal rim loss is there. And because of the loss, the cup has extended to that place. So you can see there is a superior loss here. The neuroretinal rim is extremely thinned out. Plus you can see a superior RNFL thinning also. In this patient, you can see there is an inferior loss of rim. You can see it's very subtle, but you can make out some RNFL thinning inferiorly. Another very important thing is the color of neuroretinal rim. in general, every glaucoma patient, the remaining neuroretinal rim is almost always pink. You don't see white or pale rim in a glaucoma patient. However, certain types of glaucoma, for example, patient with very high pressure like acute angle closure attack, or patient who have got uveitic glaucoma, who has got associated maybe a papillitis. These patients, you can have a pallor of neuroretinal rim, but generally we'll see glaucoma patient, the rim will be pink. For example, this patient, you can see the rim is extremely pale. So pallor is a very strong sign that you probably are dealing something beyond glaucoma. So this is a particular study which is being a landmark study in Archive of Ophthalmology, where they have analyzed the key factors indicating glaucoma and non-glaucomatous disc. And they found that pallor to be almost 94% specific for non-glaucomatous copy. And focal and rim loss is almost 87% specific for glaucoma. So take home message is, whenever you see pallor, try to exclude non-glaucomatous causes before you jump into the diagnosis of glaucoma. I'll give you a certain example like post-neuritic optic atrophy, where you can have pallor with secondary cupping. Traumatic optic neuropathy, you can see one eye, the disc is pale, the other eye disc is normal. Again, when you see a unilateral presentation, try to look for secondary causes, try to look for non-glaucomatous causes. A comprehensive optic neuropathy, where you can have a classical field damage. So the third R is the examination of the retinal nerve fiber layer. Again, it's extremely vital. You can do an examination by a high plus lens on a slit lamp. For a better evaluation, you can use a red-free light or a green light, which can give you a better assessment of the retinal nerve fiber. What we need to look at is try to look for striations, try to look for the brightness of the nerve fiber layer, and also look for any diffuse or localized loss of the retinal nerve fiber layer. This is a normal pattern, how the retinal nerve fiber converge at the optic disc. And these are the bright striations which we normally see in a patient with a normal and healthy retinal nerve fiber layer. You can see a normal RNFL, bright striations can be seen. And this is a patient with a diffuse loss. You can see there is no striations, no RNFL can be assessed, and the blood vessels are appearing to be bare. You can see it's a totally lusterless retina, which is indicating of a diffuse loss of retinal nerve fiber layer. What is more commonly seen is the localized loss, especially in early glaucoma. So you need to find out these areas of localized loss of RNFL. We can often see wedge-like defect following the pattern of the retinal nerve fiber layer. Again, the fourth thing is the region of parapapillary atrophy. Again, in the parapapillary area, you have the alpha zone and the beta zone. What we are more concerned is the beta zone, especially for glaucoma point of view. These are the atrophy of retinal pigment epithelium and choriocapillaries. Again, these are more common in glaucoma eyes. And what is seen that as the time progresses, you will see a gradually increase in the beta zone. And the fifth thing is the retinal disc hemorrhages. You can see these flame cell hemorrhages which are present in the prelamellar layer. So basically, this indicate that maybe there is a possibility of glaucoma progression. You try to look into systemic factors also. Sometimes these hemorrhages can be seen without glaucoma also. For example, in patient with optic disc drusen, patient with posterior vitreous detachment, often patient with diabetes or hypertension also. But in established glaucoma, this is an indirect evidence that you might be having a progression in glaucoma. This photography sometimes is extremely crucial for these patients. Like this particular patient on a routine disc evaluation, we missed the disc hemorrhage, but when we took a disc photograph, there was a very small disc hemorrhage which we could locate. So a good disc photograph can be useful to give you an extra information compared to a routine disc evaluation. We should also be aware of conditions which can mimic glaucoma, like a coloboma or a tilted disc or a drusen or optic disc pit. These should be kept in mind. Also have a complete evaluation of the fundus. Sometimes if we're just looking at the disc, it may look like a cupped disc, but when you see in detail, you can see there is a coloboma inferiorly. So before stamping a patient with glaucoma, have a complete fundus evaluation and always correlate your disc finding with your visual fields and your OCT finding before you stamp the patient as glaucoma. So before I end, I just like to share a few clinical examples. This is the first patient. So we'll just follow the 5R which we have been discussing. The first is the stellar ring. So in this case, it's a small disc. You can see the rim thinning. The second R, you can see the rim thinning is there. Third R is the RNFL defect. You can see the RNFL defect inferiorly. There is no peripapillary atrophy, but yes, there is a hemorrhage. So there are multiple signs indicating that definitely there are signs of glaucoma. So this is a glaucomatous disc. Another patient, average size disc. You can see the neuroretinal rim is healthy. There is no obvious RNFL thinning. There is no peripapillary atrophy, and there is no disc hemorrhage. So this is a normal disc. Third case, you can see very clearly there is a thinning of neuroretinal rim superiorly and inferiorly, an average size disc with a notching superiorly and inferiorly. Third R, RNFL loss. Yes, you can see RNFL loss superiorly and inferiorly. Peripapillary atrophy is there, but small, not very significant. There is no hemorrhages, but the notching and RNFL loss indicate that this is a patient of glaucoma. Fourth patient, again, you can see the disc size is average. There is inferior thinning. You can see the inferior, there is sloping and thinning inferiorly. There is diffuse RNFL loss. You know, obvious RNFL loss here. Small area of peripapillary atrophy is there, again, not very significant, and there is no disc hemorrhage. But based on the inferior thinning, again, you have to correlate with your disc finding whether there is a loss or not. Is the time over?
Yes, so the scheduled time is up.
Sure.
If
Thank
you would
so
like
much.
to
So I'll
take
just, anyway, it's over. I'll just come to my concluding slide.
Ji, sir.
So to conclude, I'll say it's extremely important disc evaluation for your diagnosis. Also, we need to see that IOP fluctuates. You have a dependency on the performance in case of visual field, but disc is extremely crucial. Have to have patience, need to practice it regularly, and need to look for these subtle signs. Always try to do a dilated evaluation so that you can not miss these findings. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Manish. I think that was wonderfully done. He has really beautifully covered the entire disc. And I just want to reiterate one or two points for the PGs. Please always see the disc with dilatation, because otherwise you will make mistakes, especially if you're a beginner. Always use the red free light to catch the wedge defects, or even otherwise, because sometimes you'll not be able to make out the pallor and the changes. Always, like Manisha has explained to you, check the size, check the eosinophil. It is the NRR which you are working at. Okay, and if you have the disc hemorrhage, yes. So at least the gross signs you should be able to make out. Every day I see patients whose cataract has been done, but the disc has not been looked. And we then get one-eyed patients. For God's sake, all PGs, everybody, you have to dilate a patient to see these things. Thank you very much, Manish.
Thank you so much, sir. So we'll move on to our next topic, that is pearls in the interpretation of visual field defects in glaucoma by Dr. Ganesh Raman, sir. So Ganesh Raman, sir, is the head of the Department of Glaucoma Clinic at Arvind Eye Hospital, Coimbatore, and he has published several papers in national and international peer-reviewed journals. Over to you, sir. You're looking forward to learning from you.
Thank you, Dr. Rolika, for the introduction. I thank AOS for providing me this opportunity to speak to you on the pearls in the interpretation of visual field defects in glaucoma. So when we look at a visual field, what we are trying to find out is there's a decrease in the retinal sensitivity, whether it is there or not. And if it is there, what is the degree of decrease in retinal threshold? That is how much. And where is it located? We are bothered about where it is located. If it's very far in the periphery, we're not bothered. But if it's very close to the fixation or in the arcuate region, we are definitely bothered about it. And if the degree of fall is statistically significant. These are three things which we have to answer. And we all have to remember the Anderson's criteria, which states that in two consecutive fields, location which is typical of glaucoma defect, a cluster of 3 or more non-edge points, which are all depressed to P less than 5%, one of which is depressed to P less than 1%, with a GHD outside normal limits with the PSD less than 5%. So these are all definitions of a glaucomatous visual field defect when you find in the printout. Now, the machine has a software which is known as a StatPack, and it, as you all computers, as you are aware now, that whatever you put into it is what you come out with, what comes out. So if you put in proper things, you'll get a decent report which you can interpret. So it will analyze certain conditions only. So test pattern is central 30-2, 24-2, 10-2. Test strategies are CETA standard, CETA fast, fast pack, full threshold, and the stimulus size only size 3. Anything else, it may not analyze and give you a appropriate result. So when you see a visual field, you have certain zones. Zone 1 is the patient and the test data information. Zone 2 is foveal threshold and reliability indices. Zone 3 is the raw data. Zone 4 is the grayscale. Zone 5 is the total deviation plots. Zone 6 is the pattern deviation plots. And number 7, Zone 7 is global indices, and then glaucoma hemifield test. So patient identification is very important, especially the patient's name. More important is the date of birth also. And some centers, for example, like ours, we only use the identification number because spelling mistakes can happen in patient's name every time they come back to the clinic. So we use the identification number. And date of birth is very important because you have a age adjustment of the StatPack normative data. That means age matched output is given for the printout. And also, as we'll come to know a little later, age is important for optimizing the test conditions. Certain factors affect the test. So number 1 is the pupil size. A constricted pupil will give you a constricted visual field. Dilated will give you a depressed visual field. So appropriate pupil size is 3 to 4. Visual acuity, anybody who is not legally blind can do a visual field, but usually we recommend 6/60 as the lower end cutoff. People who are having less than 6/60 can do visual field testing with special adjustment in the machine. Stimulus size, Goldman size 3 is the standard. And the white color is the standard which we use. And test strategy and pattern are all these which can be used, and you can get a good output from the machine. Refractive correction is very important because refractive blur reduces retinal sensitivity to perimetric stimuli. So trial lenses are used for clear vision in the central field, and 1 diopter refractive blur in undilated pupil will reduce by 1 decibel of the hill of vision. Fixation target are usually central. You have other fixation target, for example, patients with macular pathology or people with patients with coloboma, retinofundal coloboma can do a visual field also with the other fixation targets. Fixation monitor is done by 2 techniques. One is the gaze tracker, which is the dual variable gaze tracker, measures the gaze direction every time a stimulus is presented. So it's given as a strip of small upstrokes and downstrokes in the bottom of the visual field, and they are very precise. They can assess 1 degree of deviation from the fixation. And if there's a full scale error, for example, here you have a very high upstroke, that means more than 10 degrees of deviation has occurred. And lines which are shown as deflecting down shows that the instrument was unsuccessful in measuring gaze during that particular gaze direction. That means patient is either closed his eyes or removed the chin from the chin rest. So these are the indications which tell you how the patient has been performing the test throughout the test period. Fixation monitoring is again done by the Heel-Krakow method. So you have 5% of the stimuli which are presented to the blind spot. And if you see the image here, all the sizes of the stimuli are smaller than the blind spot. So they are designed in such a way that they fall within the blind spot. And in the visual field, grayscale, you have a small triangle which shows that this is the area which has been tested for the blind spot. Coming to foveal threshold and reliability. This is measured at the beginning of the test. That is, the foveal threshold is measured at the beginning of the test, and improper focusing by the patient reduces the foveal threshold along the remainder of the visual field. And it's very important to see the visual acuity and the foveal threshold. Anybody with 6/6 should have a foveal threshold better than 32 decibels. Other reliable indices which are very important are fixation losses, false positive and false negative errors. So for example, here you have a patient who has done a visual field and you have a high fixation losses. 4 out of 11. So it has been flagged. So this also shows as a low test reliability. And then this is the right eye the patient has done. Once he does the left eye, you find that he has done an improvement in the visual field. So this is also because of the learning effect which patient will have. Again, showing here, the fixation losses is very high, 6 out of 6. And you can see the patient has been roving his eyes all around. You can look at the gaze tracker. Sorry, false positives are very important reliability index. The CETA machine uses a reaction time window to calculate false positive. That is, the patient responses are made impossible or unlikely times. So that is what the machine tries to detect. So if the response is made just before or during the stimulus presentation or too soon after the stimulus presentation, machine calculates that as a false positive. That's why age comes into a factor here, mainly because elderly people will be slow to react, younger people will be fast to react. So taking into consideration patient reaction times measured during the test, same test. So this is how the false positives are defined by the machine and given as an output. And this is only done after the test is over. So during the test, you can of course encourage the patient to do better, but the analysis is done after the test is over. So here you have a very young patient, 10 years of age and he has high false positives, that is 44%. And then you have white scotomas on the gray scale. And you also have, this is also known as a trigger happy patient. And if you have more than 15% false positive, the guided progression analysis, this is the serial examination of the visual field, this particular examination will be excluded from that analysis. This is something which you have to remember. So false negative response are again designed to measure inattention. They are designed to identify patients who have failed to respond to stimuli that they should have seen already. So 33% of that, if it crosses 33%, the machine will default, and the causes include inattentiveness, fatigue, and hypnosia. In advanced glaucoma, you will get high false negative, which is attributed to, again, fixation losses. And the pattern which you get is a clover leaf pattern. This is an 80-year-old person who has done the visual field in the right eye, and by the time he went on to do the left eye, he felt so fatigued that he has got high false negative of 13%. So elderly people may sleep off during the test at the end of the, when they start doing the second eye. You have to make sure that they do the second eye as good as the first eye. If the other eye is advanced, then you can always ask the patient to do the advanced eye first and then do the better eye little later. Test times are something which we have to remember. The SITA standard finishes the test in 7 minutes, SITA 24-2 in 7 minutes, SITA fast 24-2 in 5 minutes. If you do a 10-2, it's even earlier and shorter test periods. Raw data is very important. So it is the exact retinal sensitivity of the selected points, and you can always compare the threshold values in the upper arcuate area to the lower arcuate area for any pattern, because as we all know, glaucoma is primary glaucomas are a disease of asymmetry, not only asymmetry between the eyes, but asymmetry within the eye also. So for example, here you can find that the patient is actually, the visual field looks very good. It's a visual field index of 100%, mean deviation of plus 0.26, but you have an inferior RNFL small loss here, if you can make out in the fundus photograph, and in the sector map shows a defect. And this is corresponding to the nasal depression of 27 decibels, which you see in the upper area, whereas the other points are all above 32. So if you are keen to look at the visual field, you can pick up the subtle changes and also correlate them clinically. Grayscale helps you to identify gross, false negative, false positive, and also explain to the patient what exactly is the field defect. Total deviation plot means the degree of deviation of this patient's retinal sensitivity from the expected age-matched normal. So you have symbols which are assigned, and the pattern deviation plot is the decibel deviation from the total deviation numerical plot, which are altered in such a way that the mild to moderate degree of decibel deviations are eliminated. Only greater degree of decibel deviations are highlighted. So what it does is take the 7th best point is subtracted from all the values in the TDNP plot, and then the plot is generated. So if you look down here, the 7th best point is -2 in the lower field, and any value which is subtracted, so -5 minus 2 gives you -3, -6 minus 2 gives you -4. So like that, you get the pattern deviation numerical plot. And the PD plot will show localized depressions, such as glaucoma, and removes generalized depressions such as cataract and refractive error. PD plot is not generated if the mean deviation less than -20 decibels. Global indices are mean deviation, pattern standard deviation, visual field index. Mean deviation shows the age-matched deviation from normal. So it is center-weighted. Normal values are ±2 decibels. Very high values can also be got advanced field. And pattern standard deviation is, it summarizes the localized loss in a single index. So it's very useful for telling it a single value, what is the end result. So high PSD is moderate to advanced losses, you get high PSD. And low PSD values you can get in normal fields or uniformly depressed fields or blind fields. So what is the relation between the two is that what is the pattern of standard deviation around the mean deviation? This is what you have to understand. You can also correlate between the two. If the two maps look alike, little or no generalized depression, for example, here there is no generalized depression, both the maps look alike. Depressed TD map with normal looking pattern deviation. So this looks like a depressed total deviation, whereas normal pattern. So this could be related to a media or refractive index related issue. A pattern deviation map worse than the TD map may be a trigger happy patient. For example, here you have a normal total deviation, whereas the pattern deviation is very depressed, and you have excessive high false positivity and a mean deviation of +7. And the GHT shows abnormally high sensitivity. Coming to GHT, this is nothing but the comparison of the, like I said, the asymmetry within the eye. So 5 zones are split in the visual field, and they compare to the reciprocal, the upper to the lower zones. And outside normal limit says is in the populations less than 1%. Borderline could be glaucoma suspects, which in the population 1 to 3%. And generalized reduction of sensitivity, it could be because of small pupil, refractive error, fatigue, and advanced glaucoma. Abnormally high sensitivity, like I showed you in the previous slide, a trigger-happy patient, and a normal patient is fitting the Anderson's criteria for calling the patient as a normal. So visual field index is calculated as a percentage of normal visual field after age adjustment. This is also center weighted, just like the mean deviation, and correlates with the ganglion cells in the macula. So it's 100% in normal field and 0% in perimetric blind eyes. And the visual field index is calculated from the PD plot if the mean deviation is better than -20. If the mean deviation worse than -20, it is calculated from the total deviation plot. So this is how it is calculated. And you can see here in this example, the mean deviation is minus 0.77, whereas the visual field index is reduced by 8%. So although the mean deviation is normal, visual field index is center weighted, so it shows a 8% loss, close to 10% loss. Artifacts are important. You can get rim scotomas. So you find that the scotoma is marching behind the blind spot. Then you have artifacts related to ptosis and media opacity and the lens of the which you keep, it should be clean. All those things can also induce artifacts. And type of field defects, you have nasal step, biarcuate. You can have a nasal step which is peripheral, as well as a central nasal step, in which you have a Berum scotoma. And here you have a arcuate and a biarcuate scotomas. And you also have supposing you do a 24-2 and you find that this fixation is involved, then you do a 10-2, you find that the fixation is actually not involved. So in a 24-2, if you find that the fixation is involved, you should always do a 24-2. In certain conditions, you should also do a 10-2 along with a 24-2. And here you can find the fixation is involved, and when you do a 10-2, you find definitely that the fixation is involved. Macular split is when you have one quadrant with 0 decibels. Or across the quadrant, you have 2 points which are 0 decibels. So I'll stop here. Thank you for a patient listening.
Thank you, Ganesh. I really envy you. You had to constrict a 2-hour lecture into 15-20 minutes, but beautifully done. I think you have covered practically all the points. Would you like to give just 3-4 pearls to a person who are not doing it too often, that whenever they take the patient for the fields, what really things they should look before?
I think before you even take the patient for field, you should do a thorough clinical examination. You must anticipate what is going to be the test results. So there's a pre-test probability. So like I showed in the image, you see the RNFL defect, subtle, and then do the visual field, look for it. Look for that finding in that. When you order the field, make sure the same order it comes back to you. Don't order a 24-2 Sita standard and then it comes back to you as a 24-2 Sita fast. And elderly patients, when you start doing, make sure that they're comfortable. If you have a series of visual fields of 24-2 Sita standard, you can convert them to a Sita fast later on. But sufficient number of fields you should have. What you give into the machine is what comes out of it. So that's something which you have to really understand.
That's very nice saying. Yes. And be very careful. Please check the pupil. Please check the refraction. Please check there is no ptosis. And be careful about the learning defects. If you go tomorrow into the practice, please, you must know that you will have to redo some of the fields. So don't worry about that. If you feel there are slightest changes in the macular field, then you may have to go for 24-2C or a 10-2 field also. So thank you very much, Ganesh. Let's move on, Rolika.
So I welcome our next speaker, Dr. Sushma Tejwani, and ma'am's topic is surgical management of glaucoma, which is a video-assisted presentation. So ma'am is the consultant and head of glaucoma services at Narayan Nethralaya, and she has a work experience of which goes beyond nearly 20 years. And that is 7 years she worked at LVPI, and then she's been a part of Narayan Nethralaya for the past 12 to 13 years. So ma'am, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Rolika. Very good afternoon to all of you. I would like to thank AIOS and Dr. Honawar for giving me this opportunity to speak about surgical management of glaucoma today. Well, there are different techniques for surgeries, and there are different indications related to that. And the choice largely depends on multiple factors. Well, that range from amount of target IOP that you've chosen for an individual, what is the kind of surgery patient has undergone, what is the degree of a field loss, what is the risk profile of the patient, and most importantly, what is the preference and experience of a surgeon who is going to take care of the case. Not to forget that we have to keep in mind patient's opinion and expectation about the surgery, and also how often patient would be able to come for follow-up. So in general, the principles are that the decision of surgery should be based on evidence-based practice, and there are multiple factors that to be kept in mind. Surgery should be considered when medical therapy and laser fail. However, it should not be kept as a last resort. Angle closure glaucoma should be dealt with PI first, and primary congenital glaucoma or pediatric glaucoma, we need to understand surgery is the main goal, and goniotomy or angle surgeries in with or without combination with filtration surgery is what is to be done based on the condition. Secondary glaucomas have to be treated along with the treatment of the primary cause, and the choice of surgery may be different than the primary glaucoma. So basically, when the optic nerve function is failing or we are not able to achieve sufficient IOP reduction, whether it is related to the efficacy of the drugs or compliance or side effects or affordability of the drugs, and we are seeing progression of visual field, is when the surgery is indicated. So just to give you a short algorithm, like if you have an uncontrolled intraocular pressure with maximum tolerated visual therapy, you have multiple options like TRAB, like express shunt, or non-penetrating glaucoma surgeries. I'll explain in detail further. Once, if that set of surgeries are failing or there are poor chances of success, then we look at shunts, particularly when there's also scarred conjunctiva. And if we have a poor visual prognosis or low possibility of surgery, then we go towards the cyclodestructive surgeries. The newer surgeries or mix fall somewhere here between the medical therapy and the trabeculectomy, because the pressure control we achieve there is not very low. Now, let me explain you a little bit about the trabeculectomy basic technique, this being the most common surgery. Now, doing a conjunctival incision here, this can be limbal based or phonics based. This is a limbal based incision where you can separate the conjunctiva and tenons and reach the episcleral tissue, cauterize, and then make a partial thickness scleral flap. Now, I prefer a triangular flap. It can be rectangular as well. What you need to understand is this is a partial thickness flap, so you need to be careful of maintaining a plane once you have achieved that. You can use a 15 number blade or you can use a crescent for making that. Once you reach the clear cornea, you should mark the posterior trabecular meshwork and then enter and excise that. Now, trabecular meshwork block excision can be done using Kelly's sponge, like how it is being done here after entering through the marks that you made, or even with the Vanna scissor by holding the flap so that you excise. And then after that, a peripheral iridectomy is done. You have to make sure that the full thickness iridectomy is there before you actually close the scleral flap with tenonylon suture. Now, whether a single suture or 3 sutures, it depends on how much filtration do you want in a given patient. Always bury the knots after closing the scleral flap. And the conjunctival flap can be closed with atovicryl. In this particular situation, it is being closed with a continuous per string suture because it's a limbal based flap, so that you only have a couple of sutures towards the edges. If you have to do a combined surgery, that means if you have to combine cataract with glaucoma, when do we do that? When we are anyway planning a glaucoma surgery and there is a visually significant cataract, or if the patient has advanced glaucoma and is on multiple medications and you're planning a cataract surgery. So based on the desired IOP control, the severity of glaucoma, and anticipated benefit after cataract extraction is when you decide about the combined surgery. Things that you need to keep in mind is whether a one-site surgery or two-site surgery, whether a limbal incision or phonics-based incision does not affect the outcome much. So it depends on your preference. Mitomycin C should be used in most of the cases when you're doing a combined surgery unless contraindicated. So just a little algorithm: when you have glaucoma with cataract, if the IOP is high and your disc and field is normal, you should do only cataract surgery. If the IOP is high and there is moderate glaucoma or early to moderate glaucoma, you should do combined surgery if there is poor compliance or the tolerance to medication is not good. If there is advanced damage, whether your IOP is controlled with medication or the IOP is high, you should preferably go for a combined surgery. And if you have early changes on disc and fields and the pressures are controlled, there is no doubt to do only cataract surgery. So now, how do you combine cataract with the trabeculectomy? When you're doing a phaco, it's simple to use a side pot to make a CCC and then start your conjunctival incision. Now, this is a fornix-based incision that you're seeing. And after that, you make a partial thickness scleral flap, as we saw in the previous video also. Once you reach the clear cornea, the same process of marking of posterior trabecular meshwork, and then you enter with the keratome. So the same incision you can use to perform your phaco emulsification, and then put the intraocular lens in the bag, and then excise the trabecular meshwork block using any of the instruments that you feel comfortable with, like Kelly's punch or Dvanas, and do a good peripheral iridectomy before you close the scleral flap with tenonylon suture. The conjunctival flap closure here is being done with interrupted sutures. Important thing here is to anchor these two edges with the episcleral tissue near the limbus, so that your flap does not retract back, and the rest you can close with the interrupted sutures. If you have to combine a small incision cataract surgery with trap, there is no need to have a separate triangular incision. You can just use your SICS incision and make it little anterior, 1 or 1.5 millimeter anterior to what you usually make, and then do this trabecular meshwork block excision and PI after you put the lens in the bag. So at the same flap near the block excision, you can use a suture to close. So this is the area that would work as a bleb, and the conjunctival closure is the same way as you had seen in the previous video. Now, when do you use releasable suture? When you want to avoid hypotony in the initial phase but need a relatively lower target pressure, when MMC is contraindicated and you anticipate hypotony, or when you need to adjust the intraocular pressure post-operatively. Whether you use 1, 2, or 3 depends on how is the amount of adjustment that you require. However, these are not preferable in children or patients who cannot cooperate on the slit lamp post-operatively. Now, how do you put a releasable suture? After you put a fixed apical suture, you can take a bite through the partial thickness cornea on the side, so that you can leave the loose end of the suture there, and take your side suture like how you would take, and tie it with 4 throws with the loop that is between the corneal incision and your entry at the scleral flap. So once you've taken 1 throw, then you can cut the suture, and the closure is the same way. Now, when you have to remove this suture in the OPD, sorry, I must go further. Yeah, so when you have to remove this suture in the OPD, what you need to do is you have to lift the suture out of that partial thickness corneal tunnel that you had created for the suture, so that it is available to you. Now, this patient, I wanted to cut the suture and not release the suture. So you can just hold this suture and use a needle to cut the edge near the limbus. So the rest of the cut edge is retracted under the conjunctiva, so there is no more exposed suture there. And in a situation where you want to release the suture, again, take it out through the corneal tunnel and pull the suture down as the patient is looking down, and you can gently take it out. So what you need to remember here is when you release a suture, always check for a leak. So do a Siedel's test after you release a suture, so that there is no leak there. In case you find a small leak, you can always use a contact lens for a few days. Mitomycin C is very commonly used in different dosages like 0.2 to 0.4, and the timings based on how much is the hypotony or the pressure control that you would want, and on a large area, so that it is not giving you a localized bleb. According to the Moorfield Safer Surgery System, there is also a Ologen implant that many people use to improve the quality of bleb, so you don't get a very thin bleb after mitomycin C. 5-FU is a relatively milder antifibrotic that is used post-operatively. So this is given as just an injection in the under slit lamp only post-operatively near the bleb if you see congestion or fibrosis around the bleb. So 3 to 7 injections at weekly intervals are what can be used to reduce the fibrosis in the bleb area to improve the filtration. Well, let us now see what are the indications for glaucoma drainage devices. Basically, when trabeculectomy is unlikely to be successful, that is when we use glaucoma drainage devices, or in certain, sorry. or in certain situations where there is neovascular glaucoma, uveitic glaucoma, or there is a lot of scarring, where we use the shunts. So now the limiting factor here is also the scar formation around the plate. So if there is scarring near the limbus, that is okay. But if there is scarring in the fornices, even the glaucoma drainage device can become difficult. And the larger surface area of the plate are associated with lower IOP. To take you through the video of a valvular drainage device or the AMF valve, you have to do a large conjunctival pocket. This is being done in the supratemporal area. So these are the two relaxing incisions because you need a large pocket. And this is the priming of the valve. It is important to prime a valve before you put it so that it works after you insert it. Otherwise, if the air is there or the valve is not functioning well, you would not realize, and the surgery will fail. Then you need to anchor the plate around 8 to 10 millimeter from the limbus. This is being done with the Prolene suture with 2 eyelets. Once you've tied the suture, make sure that you bury the knot inside those grooves so that it does not erode the conjunctiva. The tube can be cut 2 to 3 millimeter inside the limbus and is inserted in such a way that it does not touch the cornea or the iris. And the path is started from around 2 millimeter or 1.5 millimeter beyond the limbus. Now, this part of the tube is also fixated to the sclera so that it does not move. And this is covered with either a scleral patch graft or a cornea or a pericardium, whatever you like, and it can be closed with the glue or sutures. And over that, the conjunctival sutures are used to close the flap, that is by vicryl sutures or absorbable sutures. Now, there are certain differences between a valvular and a non-valvular implant. So just to tell you what are the differences, the conjunctival flap that you make for a non-valvular implant is larger, and the plate is fixated under the muscle. So you need to isolate the muscle, like in this, we are doing in between the inferior and the lateral rectus. And important thing is that you need to ligate the tube so that to avoid hypotony, and make the fenestrations with the needle proximal to the ligature so as to allow some filtration till the time ligature is opened up. There is also something known as express shunt, which has become very popular. However, due to cost issues, it is not as popular as trabeculectomy. And the surgical procedure is very simple, as good as the trap. The only thing that you need to do different here is that after making the conjunctival flap and the partial thickness scleral flap, you need not excise the posterior trabecular meshwork. Now, this is a patient who has had a failed trap already. This is the scarred area that you can see. So the dissection is little difficult, but here you can manage with a small area also. So once you've created a flap, you only need to identify scleral spur and insert a needle where you're going to put the express shunt. So this is what the needle is being inserted and the express shunt being inserted there. So once you relieve the stylus, this is where the shunt goes. So it is as simple as that. And then you should close how you would close for any trap procedure. So advantage there is that you don't have to enter the anterior chamber much. Then there are some non-penetrating glaucoma surgeries. However, again, they have not become very popular because the success rates have not been as good as trap or express. And over a period of time, they tend to fail. However, just to give an idea to you of how the surgical procedure is, here you make a large rectangular flap, which is partial thickness. And this is not the half thickness, this is 1/3 of the thickness. So once you've created that, you create another flap, which is triangular under this. That is again 1/3 of the thickness. So once you make this flap has to be excised. And idea is to reach to the Schlem's canal. So you identify the Schlem's canal, and the roof of the Schlem's canal is actually excised. So this is a fine dissection that is taking care of removing only the roof of the Schlem's canal. And this is putting a spacer so that the aqueous ooze keeps continuing up to the subconjunctival space. The flap is closed as in any other surgery that we have been seeing. So another segment is minimally invasive glaucoma surgeries. How these have been very popular recently because they can be done through a clear corneal approach. And the safety profile is very high. However, they have modest efficacy. I'm not going to talk about MIGS today because this is beyond the scope of this talk. So last but not the least is the cyclodestructive procedure. When nothing works or the visual prognosis is very poor, in those situations, we resort to cyclodestructive surgeries like this. It's a diode laser being done or transscleral photocoagulation. However, we need to keep in mind the complications like hyphema, CME, vision loss, and even phthisis in some situations. So that has to be kept in mind. So to end, the points to remember are that you need to understand the interaction between disease, treatment, and quality of life, and which is unique to each individual. So accordingly, you have to plan the surgery. Always measure the risk-benefit ratio when you're advising any invasive procedure to a patient. And remember, trabeculectomy is still the most popular glaucoma surgery. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Sushma. I think you're really covered in that little time. You've really covered everything. You haven't left anything, just one or two points. Very rightly, Sushma said that please be careful. Angle closure has 3 times more blindness than OAG. So maybe you can plan your surgeries earlier than you would in open angle glaucoma. If you are a postgraduate and you've just passed out, don't be scared to refer the patient, because if a surgery is needed, it is needed. And as a current level, would you, Sushma, prefer to do a Phoenix flap or a limbal based flap?
Most of the situation I use a phonics based flap, but in children I still prefer a limbal based flap so that
the
they don't
rub. All showed were limbal based, so I was wondering if you
only traps when I do, I still use in many patients, younger patients especially, so that I don't get those problems with rubbing and all.
Okay. And the corneal traction suture office, right?
With all due respect, I request all the doctors to please sum it up in the next minute.
Yeah,
we are running late.
Thank you, Sushma. We can go ahead, and we are waiting for Ronnie. Rolika, can you introduce Ronnie?
Yes. So Dr. Ronnie, would you like to share a screen, sir? So sir is the director of glaucoma services at Shankara Nethralaya, and his expertise is in glaucoma epidemiology, optic nerve head analyzers, angle closure glaucoma, and even the glaucoma genetics. And he'll be covering glaucoma X-files. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Rolika. So what I will try to do over here is
So you're on mute, sir.
Yeah, so when you look at the list of cases that you get in an exam, it's a very long list. And what I thought I'll do is I will just tell you what is the minimum that we would like to we would like to know as examiners when you are examining a case. And obviously the minimum is what we need for glaucoma diagnosis and what we need for management. So when you look at diagnosis, you're looking at classifying it as either developmental or primary open angle or angle closure, or secondary open angle or angle closure. So the two important things there are the status of the angle, and the second is whether it is primary or secondary. And this is information you will need to get from your clinical evaluation. And your clinical evaluation starts from history. Your age at diagnosis will tell you whether it is more likely to be a developmental or a secondary glaucoma. Don't forget that most primary glaucomas are asymptomatic, including angle closure glaucoma. So if your patient has symptoms such as pain, headache, and other things, look for an acute glaucoma or look for a secondary cause. Always ask a history of trauma and a history of eye surgery. And of course, a family history is always helpful because that could also help you to assess which type of disease it is. The other important medical history for us is from 2 points of view. One is from the point of disease risk, and second is from the medication point of view. So you need to ask a history of asthma. You need to ask a history of heart disease because that will impact how you treat the patient. The history of thyroid or steroid use may give you a hint as to the etiology of the reason. Many of these patients will be on medication, and you should ask how often they use it, how regularly they use it, and what allergies they have, because these are all questions that will be helpful later in the examination findings. And in India, it's always important to at least know what the patient is doing, because you will have to start these patients on medication on a long-term basis, and your examiner could well ask you why you are prescribing an expensive prostaglandin when the patient can't afford it. When it comes to assessment of vision, don't forget that unless you have very poor central vision, visual acuity is usually spared till late in disease. So if you have poor central visual acuity and the damage is not that severe, look for another cause of decreased vision. We need to know why the vision in that patient is low. Don't assume it's because of glaucoma. The refraction will, of course, again help you to look for disease etiologies. A quick external evaluation is important. You might otherwise miss a scar close to the eye or a subtle hemangioma like this, which would give you the diagnosis in this patient straight away. Look at the lids and orbit again for signs of trauma or for signs of thyroid eye disease. And this will again help you with what disease is going on. A very careful evaluation of the pupils is important because a lot of primary glaucoma is asymmetric and you might miss a relative afferent pupillary defect unless you look for it closely. And of course, always correlate with your clinical findings. A torchlight evaluation to look at the AC depth helps. It would give you a gross idea of what's happening. When you come to a slit lamp evaluation, look carefully at the conjunctiva. Many of us ignore that, but conjunctival congestion is a sign of many sort of secondary glaucomas and acute glaucomas. But what's equally important is that many of these patients can have drug-induced hyperemia or allergy, and you might miss it if you don't invert the conjunctiva and take a look. What's also important is to take a look for a bleb. You might see a completely scarred conjunctiva with a flat bleb, with a small, tiny peripheral iridectomy there, which you may even miss on evaluation. Something which is like this, which is a large overhanging bleb, is of course more difficult to miss. But if you see a bleb like this, don't also forget to look for a bleb leak, because that is part of your bleb evaluation in a glaucoma patient. At the slit lamp, look for thinning or scarring, because that would again give you a hint as to whether there's been trauma or whether there's any other etiologies that you need to look for. Always do the von Herrick grading. Look for the peripheral anterior chamber depth and grade it. And this is important because this is a fairly good way of assessing the risk of angle closure, but this is not a substitute for gonioscopy. You cannot make a diagnosis based only on a von Herrick test. When you look at the cornea, there are a few things that you need to look at. One is corneal edema. The presence of corneal edema could suggest either very high intraocular pressures or secondary causes. And when you have localized corneal edema like this, you are basically looking at a possible viral etiology. And it's important that you look at it. Look carefully at the endothelium, because you might miss a Krukenberg spindle, or you might miss diffuse pigmentation, which is more common with pseudoexfoliation. Also, look for keratic precipitates. They will not always be this classic. You might just see a few specks here and there. And these are all hints as to what the etiology of this disease is. A good anterior segment evaluation is important, and that includes an iris evaluation. Something like this sphincter tears with a slightly sublux lens will tell you straight away what the etiology is. A retroillumination will tell you that this is pigmentary glaucoma you're dealing with. You have an iris Bombay that will tell you that this is a secondary angle closure that you're dealing with. But more subtle changes, such as an accent field anomaly, will require you to look a little bit more closely, because this would indicate a developmental disease. So you need to look at the iris carefully before you take a call. Also look at the peripheral iris carefully, because you might miss an iridotomy which is sitting under the lid or under an arcus. Look at the edge of the pupil carefully, because you might miss subtle neovascularization. And these are important signs which will help you with your diagnosis. Look at high magnification at these two, and that is absolutely mandatory. When you look at the lens, an intumescent lens or glaucoma flecken will give you the diagnosis again in a fairly straightforward manner. But look for subtle signs of pseudoexfoliation if you're getting a dilated pupil. Sometimes you may not see very much on the pupillary rim, but you will see it on the lens. And if you see the lens edge somewhere, and if you see a myopic refraction, don't forget that microspherophakia with a secondary angle closure is probably what you're looking at. When you're looking at an intraocular pressure measurement, it's mandatory that you measure the intraocular pressure in every patient with suspected glaucoma. And ideally, measure it with Goldmann appellation tonometry. Record the time of measurement, because that is important. And what is really good is if you can measure it twice or thrice and put on all those readings there, because that will give you an idea as to how reliable your pressure reading is. You will not have access to a central corneal thickness measurement, and this is something your examiner might ask you what you'd like to do, and don't forget at that point to measure that you might want to do a central corneal thickness measurement. Now, gonioscopy is a really important part of your clinical assessment, and while we are not covering it in detail in this session, there are a few things that I would like you to do. One is, don't forget that if you have the opportunity, do your gonioscopy in an undilated situation in a slightly dimly lit room. Use a short slit to ensure what are the structures that you're seeing. And that is in situ without a bright illumination and without indentation. So look at the structures seen, look at iris contour, look at trabecular measure pigmentation, and look at peripheral anterior synechiae. This is best done with a indentation gonioscope, but even if you have a 2 meter or 3 meter gonioscope, that is fine. Do it under ideal testing conditions. And there are two main things that you need to do with gonioscopy. One is you need to look at the in situ angle. Like over here, you can see that the in situ angle is actually practically closed, but on indentation, it opens up. If you do not have access to a indentation gonioscope, one of the things that you can do over here is do manipulative gonioscopy to try and open up the angle. You need to do this because you need to figure out how much of the angle you can open up, and you will need to be able to record synechiae here or there. And your gonioscopy, you need to draw and you need to put down the amount of, it's always better not to use a single grading system, but to actually write down what structures you're seeing. Because different institutions, different examiners use different grading systems. Be aware of them, but write down what structures you're seeing in dim illumination, write down what structures you're seeing after indentation or in bright illumination. These two things are important when you're putting down your gonioscopy findings. Again, if you see any abnormality in the angle, such as angle recession or iridodialysis, don't forget to mark the extent of the angle recession or iridodialysis. If the trauma is subtle, you may not see very gross angle recession, and you would need to compare that with the fellow eye in order to be able to effectively comment on what is happening. Manish Singh very elegantly and exhaustively covered disc evaluation, and disc evaluation is essential in glaucoma diagnosis. He did mention that you need to mention disc size, and that's important. You need to look for disc asymmetry. You need to comment on the neuroretinal rim. It's good to mention at this point whether the ISNT rule is followed or not. You need to comment on the optic cup. You need to comment on the color of the rim. You need to look at the retinal nerve fiber layer, and that's an important measurement. Look for optic disc hemorrhages and look for peripapillary atrophy. Some of these things is important to measure even as negative findings saying no disc hemorrhages or no RNFL peripapillary atrophy, because that will tell you as to whether there are, that you have actually looked for it. Visual fields, in some institutions, they would expect you to do a tangent screen, and you should be familiar with how you do it. You will know in your institution whether it's required or not. Confrontation is the bare minimum that you would need to do for every glaucoma patient, and that is something that will not find anything unless there is very significant damage, but that's something that you need to look at. A quick retinal evaluation if you have a dilated patient is important. Even undilated, you should try and take a look at the retina as much as possible, because very often glaucoma patients have associated retinal vein occlusions, or the retinal vein occlusion is a cause of a secondary glaucoma. Look for proliferative diabetic retinopathy. Look for changes on the macula. This is important because especially if you have an asymmetry of the vision that you cannot explain, it may be because of a macular scar, which is related to trauma. It could be because of cystoid macular edema, which could be related to either disease or drug. So when you look at the evaluation of a glaucoma patient, you have to remember that you have to classify this patient as having primary disease or secondary disease. And the only way you can classify the patient as having secondary disease is if you have actually looked and ruled out every other cause. Classify it as open and closed. And the few important things that you need to rule out is whenever you have a unilateral open angle glaucoma, carefully rule out a secondary cause. You can get unilateral POAG, but it is rare. A secondary cause needs to be ruled out before you commit to saying that this is a unilateral primary open angle glaucoma. If your vision does not correlate with the disc finding, look for coexisting disease, because you have to be able to explain any decrease in vision in a glaucoma patient before you finally conclude that it is because of glaucoma. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. I think that was wonderfully done, and he so beautifully summed up what exactly a postgraduate needs to do. Rolika, are there any questions anywhere?
So there are no questions till now, sir.
Yeah, I think then we can hand it over to Dr. Biswas.
So any of the questions that you would like to take till now, because we have 3 minutes at hand.
Okay, I think we have already.
Okay, so we can go ahead with the next talk. Not a problem.
We can for this thing.
Ji sir, sure sir.
Thank you, Dr. Harsh. So it's nice seeing you.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure.
Nice seeing you. Hopefully, we'll see physically sometime
Next year we must meet. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So next we have Dr. Rohan Chawla sir.
From glaucoma, we are going to uvea. Uvea is often a diagnostic and therapeutic challenge. And I hope that our speakers will talk about the basics of uveitis and this challenge. So Dr. Rohan Chawla is the first speaker. He will be talking about the recent advances in management of uveitis.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. And I would like to thank Dr. Santosh Honavar and AIOS also for giving me this opportunity. I hope you can see the screen.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So my topic is recent trends. So I might be talking of few things which might be a little on the higher side for postgraduates, but these are the recent trends in uveitis. So for uveitis management, all that you need to know is that first of all, most important is establishing a diagnosis. Then how do you assess the activity of the disease? And if there are any secondary complications due to uveitis, then we'll come to the treatment aspects and alternatives to steroid therapy in cases of non-infectious uveitis. So there are some recent advances in quite a few of these, starting with anterior uveitis. Common uveitis is Fuchs heterochromic uveitis, which does have a better prognosis. And there are studies now which are showing that the etiology might be viral in nature. There are studies to suggest rubella and CMV. Now, if you follow the CMV site studies, then you could modify your treatment by using topical or oral valganciclovir in these cases. But oral has a potential of toxicity, so we rarely use it only in cases which are causing significant recurrences. Otherwise, you can just use topical ganciclovir or the routine steroids. In GIA-associated uveitis, there have been now recent recommendations where 3-monthly screening has been mandated, and we prefer to use prednisolone drops rather than the higher potency difluprednate, as they have more chances of causing cataract. And if there are children who are requiring more than 1 or 2 drops of systemic prednisolone to maintain remission, then it is rather better to shift them over to immunosuppressants. And in those, subcutaneous methotrexate is one of the good options. And other than that, especially in the Western countries, there is now a lot of upcoming role of the TNF alpha inhibitors. For intermediate uveitis, the evaluation, ultra field wide imaging is gaining prominence, where we can assess peripheral areas of leakage and detect early peripheral neovascularization. For intermediate uveitis, again with the advent of 25 gauge vitrectomy, that has also been recommended nowadays because it helps to remove inflammatory mediators, but it can have potential side effects such as hypotony and sometimes retinal detachment. So one has to be a little careful while going for this option, but it is a recent trend. Just to show you one photograph, this was one case of intermediate uveitis who was TPHA and VDRL positive. So actually a syphilitic case. So when you see the ultra wide field photograph, you do not find significant changes, but when you do an ultra wide field angiography, you do see a lot of peripheral leakage happening and also a disc edema. So this patient we treated with systemic antibiotics and followed by subsequently a little bit of steroids. And you can see there is a good remission. The subsequent fluorescein angiography does show that the eye has become much quieter and the leakage has reduced. So these wide field imaging now are again a recent trend for management. Even they help when your patient's pupil is small and you want to get an image of the fundus. You might be able to better see what's happening in the peripheral retina and through the hazy vitreous. So apart from just the vitrectomy to remove the inflammatory mediators, there is a role of 25 gauge single port vitreous biopsy, especially for cases where you are suspecting a viral etiology or you are suspecting lymphomas. You could also do just an aqueous tap, but if the uveitis seems to be more posterior, the vitreous biopsy would be rather more helpful. Another investigation helpful in assessing the activity of choroiditis, especially serpiginous nowadays, is fundus autofluorescence. So when it is active and there is an accumulation of lymphocytes, you might get a hyperfluorescent halo around the central hypopatch where the lymphocytes are accumulating. Though this would indicate activity. As the disease heals under the steroids or itself, the hyperfluorescence starts getting stippled, and once you get scarring, it will turn over to hypofluorescence. So here you can see an example. This is a serpiginous choroiditis which is healing in the center and active patches at the margins. So here, if you see at the margins, you can see this fuzzy sort of hyperautofluorescence bordering the areas of hypo. So this again tells you that there is activity, and this stippled hyperfluorescence here is telling you that these are the areas of healing. So if you have doubt clinically, you can take help from this fundus autofluorescence. OCT is a major advance which helps assess the activity of the lesion and the level of the lesion, and also about the vitreous cells. So here, if you see, there is a large mound here, yellowish. It is a deep mound. If you do the OCT, you can clearly see that it is lying in the choroid and lifting the entire retina. And there is spillover inflammation here, this hyperreflectivity into the outer layers of the retina. So we investigated this patient, and this patient actually had systemic COX also. Turned out to be a tubercular granuloma, gave ATT, and you can see the nice healing. So the retinal architecture is almost normal. Most of the pathology was in the choroid. And despite these changes in the fundus, patient did regain 6/12 vision. So on the other hand, if you see this subtle sort of granuloma here, here the OCT is again showing you that the pathology is in the choroid, but it is not as aggressive as the previous one, and it is more silent, not much of spillover into the retina. And this patient was actually diagnosed as having a sarcoid granuloma, treated with mainly steroids. So the imaging helps you. So this is after treatment, you see that the granuloma is resolved. So the imaging helps you locate the level of the lesion. So another example where you see there are just on fundus maybe some fine yellow spots which you can make out. If you do an autofluorescence, it is giving you a better idea of the activity of the disease in this macular region, and even the angiography shows you fine stippling. The ICG showing you rather some hypo spots there. If you do a OCT, you get these peg-like spaces at the level of the photoreceptors and some alteration at this zone, whereas the rest of the retina and the choroid is normal. So this is highly suggestive of a multiple evanescent white dot syndrome, where the inflammation is mostly at the level of the photoreceptors. So a combination of these multimodal imaging with your clinical examination makes your job easier. Another example with patient coming of decreased vision, central vision, you do an OCT and you see heaping up at the layer of the retinal pigment epithelium. So this patient again we did treat with steroids, and there is significant resolution. The ELM, since the external limiting membrane and other bands seem to be normal. So this is a picture of something called Krill's disease or acute pigment epithelitis. So like I said, OCT can also help you see the cells in the vitreous and tell you whether it is an inflammatory disease. Regarding the secondary complications, OCT angiography has a role to play. It can help you detect choroidal neovascularization as well as activity of the disease. So another case of healed choroiditis here. When we do an OCT angiography, we see a hyper reflective structures here which suggest flow. And as this patient also had recent metamorphopsia, we suspected a choroidal neovascular membrane and treated it with anti-VEGF agents. Now this is a case with a multifocal sort of choroiditis. You see ICG, multiple hotspots here, multiple hypofluorescent areas here. The similar areas are also reflected in the choroidal segmented cut of the OCT angiography. So this again tells you that there is disease activity at the level of the choriocapillaries. You treat the patient with steroids and a lot of them start subsiding. In some cases, when there is scarring, you'll start seeing the underlying choroidal vessels, but otherwise many of these cases, they will start subsiding. And another indirect non-invasive method to test the disease activity. Regarding treatment, mostly what our aim is to maintain a remission less than 10 milligram of Visalon. Otherwise, you need to add an immunosuppressive agent. And the safety of these immunosuppressive agents, now we know various trials such as this SITE study and the MUST study, they have shown us that there are not much significant systemic complications if used at appropriate doses. And even sometimes they might be better than intraocular implants. Now, there is a new concept to this, which emphasizes a steroid-free remission. This has been given by Stephen Foster. They say that no, we don't even want less than 10 milligram, we just want zero steroid. But to achieve that, you may have to give maybe more than one immunosuppressive agent. And they say that if you maintain a patient on remission without steroids on immunosuppressives for 2 to 3 years, you might end up having a patient with a very long-term remission. But this is a new concept. But as I said, at least less than 10 milligram is what we want. We do not want patients on high dose steroids recurrent, because steroids lead to high dose of steroids lead to a lot of complications. Now in this era, better to add immunosuppressants or other immunomodulators such as these biologics. So I mentioned quite a few of them. There are studies for all of them. I would discuss a few. So most commonly what we are using is adalimumab because it can be given subcutaneous. There are studies, Visual 1 and Visual 2, which have shown good effect of these biologics. Then tocilizumab, all of you must have heard in COVID era. This is now IL-6 antagonist. Now there has been a study of stop uveitis. Now these can come to you as questions even in your fellowship examinations. So you should be aware of these new studies of uveitis, and they have shown favorable outcomes at 6 months. And this new aptitude study unfortunately did not show a significant benefit of tocilizumab over adalimumab for JIA. Another important one is to consider is rituximab. This has been shown to have good effect in JIA associated uveitis as well as VKH, and even intraocular lymphoma we can give intravitreal therapy with combination with methotrexate. Other local therapies, there are advances where there is an attempt to increase the duration of action of these. So there are implants like Ozurdex, which is a biodegradable implant. Then there are non-biodegradable implants such as Retisert and Iluvien. And another new method is a suprachoroidal injection of the steroid through a very fine needle, which also increases steroid delivery to the posterior segment. Newer options also are intravitreal methotrexate, which also has a good response in certain cases of uveitis. However, the duration of action may be less. Now, this was about non-infectious. Just coming to infectious, recent advances that for intravitreal ganciclovir higher dose is being recommended, and even oral ganciclovir treatment along with it should be performed. We are also seeing in India a lot of cases of post-fever retinitis, which may be because of viral or which may be because of rickettsia. So in these cases, rickettsia or even Lyme's disease, so in these cases, it is probably better to start treatment with an antibiotic and then go on to steroids rather than directly going on to steroid therapy. So this is an example of a case with a lot of these cotton wool-like patches, which are actually retinitis patches, cells in the vitreous. So treat with doxycycline and then go on to steroids. Going on to lymphoma, I think there is lack of time, so I'll rush up a bit. So there can be various clinical presentations of lymphoma. But this OCT again, this humps under the RP or just under the retina with these pigmentary changes in an elderly patient without CME are highly suggestive of it being lymphoma. And the diagnosis can be established by doing a biopsy, vitreous biopsy, and you can see on cytology as well as do a interleukin ratio. If this still does not establish a diagnosis, the third step would be a chorioretinal biopsy or a brain biopsy. So this is how your atypical cells would look like. They would show you a larger nuclear to cytoplasmic ratio. And this is what is required. And you can also stain them with CD20 to confirm your diagnosis. Treatment involves, again, nowadays we are going more for intravitreal methotrexate therapy along with systemic if it is a bilateral disease. And a recent advance is this ibrutinib monotherapy, which has also been tried in certain cases of B-cell lymphoma. So my take-home message is that the new imaging techniques such as ultra-wide field imaging, fundus autofluorescence, and OCT, they add to your diagnosis and they help you detect the secondary complications. But you must also have a good clinical assessment and a correlation. Otherwise, you might also get confused by these investigations. Then the cytopathology and molecular diagnosis and vitreous TAP are helping us in reaching the correct etiological diagnosis, especially such as cases of lymphoma and viral retinitis. And treatment, there is a shift towards less and less of oral steroids and proper use of immunosuppressive agents and biologics. And other newer methods of drug delivery, which can be certain forms of implants, also might help reduce the side effects. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rohan. A very elegant summarizations of advances in diagnostic techniques as well as the treatment. And as you have rightly mentioned, that new imaging techniques as being helping us to identify the diseases, uveitic diseases, much more precisely. And we are more familiar with the immunosuppressive agents now. And biologics has emerged as a new weapon against uveitis, as well as local therapy like the Ozurdex implant and intravitreal injections has now emerged as a new therapeutic modality in uveitis, so that we can save the visual function, visual morbidity can be retrieved. So with this, next talk is Dr. Partha Pratim in the UVA 5. let us introduce Dr. Parthapratim.
Yes, sir. So Dr. Parthapratim, he finished his fellowship in medical retina and uvea from Shankara Nethralaya and has joined as a senior consultant over there in the department of uvea. And he has won multiple awards for his work. And he is the mastermind behind the e-Ophtha blog that everybody knows about. And he has provided resource for the postgraduates and a lot of information to which they can access. And thank you so much, sir, for doing that.
Thanks, Dr. Bansal. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and my slide you can see. So first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Santosh Honavar for giving me this opportunity. My topic was allotted uvea X5. So what I'll do, I'll just go through some cases, and before that, because it's a program for the postgraduate, so I would request the postgraduates, if you have any query or if it remains unanswered, or you are watching this program, the recording of this program, then you feel free to mail me at drparthapratim@gmail.com. I'll be very happy to answer your query. So what I'll do, I'll show 6 case scenarios and we'll discuss the learning points from these case scenarios. Now, first I'll present 2 cases. One is 40-year-old male and the second one is 28-year-old female. The first patient, 40-year-old male, presented with minimal blurring of vision for 3 to 4 months, and there was no complaint of redness and ocular pain. The second patient had severe ocular pain, redness, intolerance to bright light, and the patient came to our clinic almost in a very acute stage. And for last 2 days, she was receiving this kind of severe pain and redness. So when we examined, we found that the right eye has the other eye is having a cells of 0.5 and flare and no KPs. Whereas the second case, it was unilateral, the other eye was quiet. Now, if you look into their symptoms, you can see that the first patient had a chronic course and it is insidious onset. Now, insidious onset is what? When a disease comes slowly and does not have any obvious symptom, then we call it as a insidious onset. In the second patient, it has an acute course and there was a sudden onset disease. Only for last 2 days, the patient was having severe pain. Now, if you look into the clinical photograph here, slit lamp photograph here, you can actually see the mutton fat KPs, absence of congestion, and you can see some iris nodules also. Whereas in the second patient, you can see the fine KPs, there are marked congestion and there is no iris nodules. So based on that, you can easily differentiate them into the first patient is a case of granulomatous uveitis and the second one is non-granulomatous uveitis. So there are many causes of them and I'm sure you know them. So what happened, we went ahead and investigated the patient. The first patient, the serum AC was raised, Montu test was negative, and HRCT showed mediastinal lymphadenopathy. So the first patient was diagnosed as a case of sarcoidosis, and the second patient, HLA-B27, was positive and started on treatment. So this is very important point. You have to understand that beginning is the most important part of any work, and when you are starting your work, uvea work, try to use this Woods or clinico-pathological classification, because this classification gives you a very good overview and provides an approach to the initial workup. Whereas the downside of this classification is it's not very definitive. You can't use granulomatous, non-granulomatous, because sometimes there will be overlapping of the clinical entities and they may change their clinical phenotype also. The third patient was 27-year-old female who presented with diminution of vision, no complaint of redness or ocular pain. However, she informed us about the elevated T3 and T4. So now if you look carefully, you can see the right eye is quite AC. Sorry, right eye was the quite anterior chamber, and the left eye, there was cells of 0.5 and there was flare. And there was diffuse distribution of KPs. As you can see here, fundus examination was within normal limit. So further, if you can examine the patient, you can make out that the blurring of iris crypts, especially at the polarity, there was absence of synechia, there was cataract in this patient, and a diffuse distribution of the KPs. Now, unilateral anterior uveitis differential diagnosis are HLA-B27 associated, Fuchs uveitis, and viral anterior uveitis. In this patient, we can easily rule out HLA-B27 because it has an acute presentation, as I already said, and they are actually recurrent in nature and they keeps alternating between the eyes. The Fuchs uveitis and viral anterior uveitis are usually confined to the single eye, but as you can make out in this patient, there was a subtle changes in the iris pattern, and there was a diffuse KPs, and if you look carefully, these are actually the stellate KPs, and so that's how you can make out that this was a case of Fuchs uveitis. Whereas in viral anterior uveitis, you have to look for the iris atrophy and various other signs, the patient will have a corneal scar. So these points can lead you to the diagnosis of the viral uveitis in a patient. So our fourth case is a 37-year-old male who complained of diminution of vision, redness, ocular pain for 15 days. The best corrected visual acuity in right eye was 6.6, left eye it was 6/36. There was history of encephalitis in 2012 when the PCR from cerebrospinal fluid was positive for the herpes simplex virus. Following that, he developed certain amount of cognitive and short-term memory loss. And when he presented to us, the right eye AC was quiet, left eye had cells of 3+ and flare 1+. Now, as you can see here, the right eye was within normal limit. The left eye, there was hyperemic disc, vitritis. You can see some areas of arteritis here also. So when we started examining the periphery, we realized the picture was different. As you can see here, right eye, there was 2 patches here of healed lesion, and here you can see the confluent lesion which was progressing actually almost in 360 degree, and you can see the arteritis patches here. So it was a case of retinitis, and retinitis involving the periphery of the retina. So he was diagnosed as a case of acute retinal necrosis. Right eye was probably the healed retinitis. So what we did, we started the patient on intravenous acyclovir. AC-TAP was done for HSV, VZV, and CMV, which was positive for herpes simplex viruses. And the patient was continued on acyclovir, and the patient was monitored weekly basis. Every week, I used to call the patient and see the patient. Now, after 3 months, as you can see here, the lesion regressed very, very nicely. You can see here the regressed retinitis patches, and the patient was continued on the acyclovir for a certain period of time. So now, what are the learning points from this case? The dilated fundus examination is must, as you have seen. If I would not have examined the patient. So next time you see a uveitis patient, examine the periphery very carefully, and the next the higher chances of the developing RDs are there. So that's why the patient was actually monitored weekly basis. Now, why AC-TAP? I'm showing you another picture here. As you can see here, this patient actually, when we did the AC-TAP, and it was positive for CMV cytomegaloviruses. Now, you have to remember that if it is caused by cytomegalovirus, acyclovir is not active in these cases because acyclovir need thymidine kinase to work, and the cytomegalovirus does not contain this thymidine kinase. So you need to do AC-TAP in cases of acute retinal necrosis. Here is the 5th case, which presented with severe diminution of vision in both eyes with cells of variable degree, cells and flare. And you can see that there are large KPs, Marten fat KPs also in one eye. So this was the picture we presented with pockets of subretinal fluid and choroidal fluids. So what are your differential diagnoses? In this scenario, pan-uveitis, you can think of mainly 3 conditions. One is posterior scleritis, one is Vogt-Koyanagi-Harada disease, and the third one is your posterior scleritis and sympathetic ophthalmia. I forgot to tell you, this patient also had the severe headache and disturbances in hearing also. So now your diagnosis has become much easier. So what all investigation we did ultrasound B scan, which showed low to medium reflective thickening of the choroid. And here is a clue I would like to share with you, that how to differentiate the VKH and posterior scleritis in ultrasound. Though it is very difficult in ultrasound, but you have to keep you have to remember that the VKH sclera is secondarily involved, whereas in posterior scleritis it is the primary structure to be involved. So that's why the sclera has a high reflectivity. When you compare both the entity, the posterior scleritis has significantly higher reflectivity of the sclera, and sometimes you can see the retrovalvular edema which causing the T sites. Now, if you look into this patient's SSOCT, you can see that it has a multilobular configuration. When we call it multilobular configuration, we mean that the subretinal fluid is organized into multiple compartments. Now, how these compartments are formed? These are formed by the inflammation-induced some fibrinous septa. Now, look into the FFA picture, you can make out that why it is multiple compartment. You see here, these are the multiple leaks here, pinhead leaks, which are actually showing the placoid pooling. So these are the areas, the multiple compartment, the dyes are accumulating and showing the placoid pooling of the disc. Now, what are the learning point from this point? So this FFA picture, is it very specific to VKH? No, it can be seen in multiple conditions. It can be seen in posterior scleritis, it can be sympathetic ophthalmia. Now, one of you may ask me that then why to order FFA in VKH? For that, I will show you another case. This is a 27-year female complained of diminution of vision, and incidentally, as you see in your clinical practice, any patient can complain of headache. So this patient also complained of some non-specific headache. So the patient was diagnosed as VKH, started on oral prednisolone 60 mg per day. And when the patient actually reached our chamber and we did the fundus fluorescence angiography, you can see here, the fundus fluorescence angiography looked a little different. There was multiple leak here also, but this leak did not show placoid pooling. It increased in size and intensity. Can you make out from here? See here, these are increasing in size and intensity. So it was a case of multiple leak CSR. So next time you can see these two cases. The first case is CSR, multiple leak CSR, and the second is VKH, where you can see placoid pooling, and here you can see the multiple leak increasing in size and intensity. So what happens under the right circumstances, these pictures can be, clinical pictures can be similar, until and unless if you do FFA, the serious consequences occur. In CSR, you have to stop the steroid, whereas in VKH, steroid is the primary treatment. Now, quickly, how to treat that particular case? You have a lot of form of steroid. What steroid you will give here? You will give pulse corticosteroid because it is sight-threatening condition, followed by oral corticosteroid and immunosuppressive. Now, why immunosuppressive will give? Because VKH causes recurrent inflammation. To prevent that recurrence, you need to give immunosuppressive. Now, any role of intravitreal steroid? Very limited and in special situation. Because VKH is a systemic disease, you have to treat the disease systemically. So when to use intravitreal steroid? For example, when a patient is pregnant, can't tolerate the high dose of steroid, that time you can think of these entities. The last concluding point is always take reliable history, comprehensive eye examination, identify the anatomical location and extent of the inflammation, and try to do systemic evaluation. This is the last case I am going to show you, a 32-year-old male with hypopion uveitis. Now there can be three pictures, three clinical scenarios the patient with hypopion can present to your OPD. The first one can have the non-granulomatous uveitis. Already we discussed severe fibrinous reaction, low backache, and complaints of recurrent attacks. So what you will do? You will advise HLA-B27 and X-ray of the sacroiliac joint. And this can be a case of, as you can make out, it was a HLA-B27. The second one, panuveitis, can have retinal vasculitis, mobile hypopion, and recurrent oral and genital ulcers. So in this case, you can simply do some tests, send to rheumatologist and make a diagnosis of Behçet disease. The third one, it can present as a panuveitis, can give you a history of hospitalization, can give a systemic association like diabetes mellitus, and can give you a history of septic foci also. So in that case, you have to do a vitreous biopsy, sent the blood and urine for culture, and clearly it was a case. It will be a case of endogenous endophthalmitis. Thank you for your hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Partho, for elegant description and giving some learning points from the several cases. I'm glad that you have highlighted non-uveitic conditions which can mimic uveitis and is very important, like Masquerade syndrome, multiple leak CSR. And distinguishing from non-granulomatous to granulomatous uveitis is important because the investigation pattern is different. And also the cases like, hypopyon in several situations, one need to distinguish the same. So thank you very much all. And thank you, Dr. Honabar for giving me this opportunity to chairing the session on the UVI. It was
so one more session is left, sir.
Yeah. So next is the neuro-ophthalmology, no?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'll leave.
Okay, sir. Please. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us and taking out your precious time, sir. Thank you, sir. So we have now moved on to our neuro-ophthalmology session, and our next speaker is Dr. Sundari, and she will be presenting the neuro-ophthalmology X-Files. She is the medical director at Dr. Agarwal's Eye Hospital and has been teaching the postgraduates for the past 16 years. So she has diverse experience of how to deliver the lecture. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Bansal. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible. Yeah. Your slides are visible.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Santosh Honavar and AAOS for giving me the opportunity to present the neuro-ophthalmology X-Files in Aishala. So today I'm going to discuss some of the important cases in neuro-ophthalmology which might interest postgraduates and which might be important for their exams. So there are certain important aspects of any neuro-ophthalmology case. So first thing is history. History is very, very important to be noted for every case, because from the history itself, you might be in a position to come to a conclusion and come to a diagnosis even. So before we go into the details of every case, I would like to say is there are certain important aspects in neuro-ophthalmology which you have to give weightage, which are vision, which is the best corrected visual acuity in both the eyes, color vision in both the eyes, extraocular movements, pupil. Examination of the pupil is a very important thing, fundus examination, and visual fields. See, each one might give you a clue about what we are dealing with. So actually, I've taken some 6 cases, each one relating to either the vision, color vision, fundus, or pupil involvement, or extraocular movements. So we're going to discuss in detail. So when we talk about the history itself, so when vision, if you're calling that there is a drop in the vision, then you see whether the patient had a sudden drop in the vision. Was it a gradual drop in the vision, or is it like was it associated with pain, or there was no pain? All that is important whenever you're dealing with any neuro-ophthalmology case. So case scenario 1. So here we are seeing an young adult, 24-year-old, with a sudden painful loss of vision in the right eye. She says for the past 2 days, there has been a drop in the vision and she's complaining of pain. On examination of the right eye, the best corrected visual acuity in the right eye was just 2/60. And the color vision, just the first plate she was able to read. Pupil had an RAPD. So extraocular movements was full, but she said complaints of pain on ocular movements. Visual field, there was a gross field defect in the right eye. Fundus examination was absolutely within normal limits. Left eye was perfectly all right. Best corrected visual acuity was normal, color vision was normal, pupil was regular, reacting to light. Extraocular movements were full. The fields was normal in the left eye, and fundus was also normal in the left eye. So this is the scenario 1. So this is a fundus photo of the patient. If you look at the fundus photo between the right and the left eye, there's no difference at all. Well-defined margins, cup is well made out. There's no hemorrhage, nothing. So you know that this is an absolutely normal disc. So you go ahead and examine the pupil. So what are we seeing? So you're doing a swinging flashlight test. So you're swinging the light from the right eye to the left eye and look at the pupil, what is happening to the pupil. So this patient has got a right eye RAPD. As you put the light onto the right eye, the pupil starts to dilate. So this is a right RAPD. So the probable diagnosis, sudden drop in the vision, pain, RAPD is present, fundus is absolutely normal. So field defects are like extensive. So you think in terms of right retrobulbar neuritis. So, okay, your diagnosis is right retrobulbar neuritis. What are we going to do next? So the first thing is basically we need to rule out a demyelinating disorder. Whenever you're seeing a young individual with an optic neuritis, especially a retrobulbar neuritis, basically we have to rule out demyelinating disorder, the most commonest being the multiple sclerosis. So when we order the MRI, what we are trying to look at is at the Dawson fingers. So these Dawson fingers are nothing but a periventricular plaque, which is around 5 millimeter in size, which are perpendicular to the lateral ventricles, and more than 2 is considered to be significant. Why diagnosing multiple sclerosis is important? Because basically, if it is a multiple sclerosis, you need to work in accordance with the neurologist to treat the patient, to prevent the patient from developing clinically definitive multiple sclerosis. So, and you will start the patient on ONTT, optic neuritis treatment trial, which is IV methylprednisolone 1 gram for 3 days, followed by oral prednisolone 1 milligram per kg body weight for the next 11 days, and fast tapering of the oral steroids. This is what you will do, and you will refer the patient to the neurologist to start the patient on interferon beta 1. So to prevent the clinically definitive multiple sclerosis. So case scenario 2. This is a young male, 25-year-old, having difficulty in reading with his left eye for the past 2 months. On examination, you find that the left eye had a miscorrected visual acuity of 6.6, and he required a small plus power, plus 0.75 for reading also. So the color vision was full, extraocular movements were full, fundus was within normal limits. And if you looked at the pupil was slightly more than mid-dilated, and the patient had a sluggishly reacting pupil. The right eye was absolutely normal. So it's just the pupil abnormality was there. The vision and the color vision were normal, but the vision had a slight hyperopic shift. So we think what are we going to do is we are going to do the light reflex for this patient. So you see the pupil is kind of mid-dilated, and if you compare it with the other eye, definitely the left eye seems to be a little dilated, and you're putting a torchlight and looking for pupillary reaction. There's not much reaction with for the light reflex. So what are you thinking of? You're thinking in terms of anisocoria. So anisocoria is when there is a difference between the size of the pupil between the two eyes. It could be physiological, it could be pathological. When you call it as a physiological, the size difference will continue to remain the same whether you're in a bright light or in a dim light. If it is pathological, if you move the patient to a brightly lit room or a dark room, dim room, then the size of anisocoria will increase. Then it is a pathological anisocoria. So the dilated pupil is well appreciated in bright light. Why? When the patient is in a bright lit room, what happens? The pupil has to constrict. If the pupil is not constricting, that pupil is the abnormal pupil. So the causes for dilated pupil and the patient having an anisocoria are going to be amerotic pupil, could be a traumatic mydriasis, could be a third nerve palsy, could be pharmacological. So in pharmacological, basically the patient will have a history of drop installation, and when you use a 1% pilocarpine, the pupil is not going to constrict because the receptors are blocked. In case of a third nerve palsy, along with the pupillary dilatation, you will have other evidence of third nerve palsy, like the patient will have a ptosis and the eye will be down and out and the ocular movements are going to be restricted. So you will exactly know whether the patient you are dealing with the third nerve palsy or not. In case of traumatic mydriasis, you will look for sphincter tears on the slit lamp and other evidence of trauma. And then we are going to deal with Adie's pupil also. Let's discuss in detail. So this is what we are rather seeing the patient. So when you look at the patient's pupil, you can see there is a sphincteric action over here and a sphincteric action over here. But the entire temporal region, there's no sphincteric action at all. So then you put the patient on the slit lamp and look carefully for vermiform contraction. What are vermiform contractions? Basically, these are worm-like contractions of the sphincter muscles. Here, if you look at the 6 o'clock position, once the light is put, you can see a fine constriction of the sphincter muscles over there, which is called as a vermiform contraction, which is very classical in Adie's. So what is an Adie's pupil? Usually, you have a large unilateral dilated pupil, absent a poor light response, vermiform contraction on the slit lamp, and near slow tonic contraction. Why does a near contraction happen? And it's a slow tonic contraction because the supply to the ciliary body to the sphincter pupillae is in the ratio of 30:1. And hence a slow tonic contraction occurs while the pupillary constriction is not that effective. And absence of deep tendon reflex in patients with ADs is called as a Holmes-AD syndrome, which everybody knows is because of the dysautonomia. So the confirmation is by using a 0.125% pilocarpine, that is 1/8 of 1% pilocarpine is what you're going to instill. Wait for 10 to 15 minutes and then look for the pupillary constriction. If it is a normal pupil, it will not constrict. If it is because of ADs, there will be a pupillary constriction because of the denervation supersensitivity. The ciliary ganglion, actually, the problem is that the ciliary ganglion and the postganglionic fibers, which are passed through the short ciliary nerves to the sphincter pupillae, is affected. And once the postganglionic lesion becomes denervation supersensitivity sets in, the pupil will constrict. So in a fresh ADs, if you try this 1%, 1/8 of 1% pilocarpine, the patient's pupil will not constrict. Wait for a few weeks and then repeat the test. You will find that the patient is responding to the 0.125% pilocarpine. So basically for the treatment, if the patient is symptomatic, then put the patient on pilocarpine. If it is asymptomatic, you can leave the patient alone. So case 3, a middle-aged man, 55-year-old, came with the complaints of double vision for past 3 days associated with pain, and there is drooping of his right upper eyelid. He's a known diabetic for past 10 years. So on examination, right eye best corrected visual acuity was 6/6, color vision was normal. On extraocular movements, there was a defective adduction, elevation, and depression, and the presence of ptosis was there. Pupil was well within normal limits, like it was round, regular, and reacting. Fundus was also normal. Left eye was normal. So when you're looking at the patient, you can make out very clearly that the patient has got a complete ptosis. On lifting the lid, the eyeball is down and out. And on checking at the extraocular movements, you can see the adduction is completely limited and the elevation is also restricted and the depression also restricted, stating that this patient has got a third nerve palsy. So the most important thing in a third nerve palsy is always to look at the pupil, whether it's a pupil sparing or pupil involving. If it's a pupil sparing, it's probably an ischemic cause. And if it's a pupil involving a third nerve palsy, it's a surgical cause. So you have to do a diplopia charting and a Hess charting. In diplopia, you will get a cross diplopia, and Hess charting is very, very important to know how the patient is progressing. So the investigations, basically the blood workup and BP, blood sugar and BP you will do. And you should always keep in mind about the giant cell arteritis, and ESR and C-reactive protein also should be worked up in an elderly population. And if it's a young person, basically imaging is very, very important, even though the pupil might not be involved in less than 10 years of age. Definitely MRI is indicated. And above 10 years of age also, always, if the pupil is not involved, also call the patient back again in a week's time to look for the pupillary involvement and assume that the MRI is absolutely normal. It's better to do a cerebral angiography to rule out aneurysm. Posterior communicating artery aneurysm is very common, which impinges on the third nerve and resulting in a third nerve palsy with the pupillary involvement. So basically, extension of the case 3, I would like to discuss this young man, 35-year-old, had a trauma and having been having a double vision for the past 3 years. On examination, you look at the patient, this is what the patient has got. The patient has got a partial ptosis on the right side. You look at the extraocular movements, the patient is moving his eyes. You can see that the adduction is full. On attempted adduction, there is widening of the palpebral fissure. And on looking down, there is a lid lap. So this is a clear-cut case of third nerve misdirection. So in a third nerve misdirection, what happens is a lid gaze dyskinesis and pupil gaze dyskinesis. In lid gaze dyskinesis, what happens? It is an inverse of Duane's. In Duane's, what happens on attempted adduction? There is narrowing of the palpebral fissure. Here, it is the inverse of the Duane's. On attempted adduction, there is a widening of the palpebral fissure because the nerve which supplies the medial rectus also supplies the LPS. And pseudo-von Wiephus happens because the nerve which supplies the inferior rectus supplies the LPS. This happens, third nerve misdirection happens only in cases of trauma or a compressive pathology where there is a misdirection of the nerve. In pupil gaze dyskinesis, you will have a pseudo-Urgell-Robertson pupil in which there will be a pupillary constriction on attempted adduction as well as in down gaze. Case 4. young 30-year-old obese female with the early morning headaches with blurring of vision at times for the past 30 days. On examination, the best corrected visual acuity was 6.6, color vision was normal, extraocular movements were full, the pupil was round, regular and reacting. But fundus examination showed a bilateral disc edema of approximately around 3 disc diopters, and fields showed enlargement of the blind spot. So this is a patient's fundus examination. If you look at it, basically the disc margins are very much blurred and elevated, and you can see the patterns lines over here. And this is a screen visual fields. If you look at the blind spot, this is the blind spot, and around the blind spot, there is a definite enlargement of the blind spot here, as well as in this eye, you can see the enlargement of the blind spot, and few peripheral constriction field changes also have started in this patient. So the investigation, basically what you need to do is always think about malignant hypertension also. So BP has to be ruled out. It's a simple test, but we have to do in any patient with the disc edema, better to rule out BP. And then MRI has to be done to rule out any space occupying lesion. And then LP to look for the opening pressure. The opening pressure more than 20 centimeters of water should be considered to be having an increased intracranial hypertension if the MRI is absolutely normal. So assume that this patient had an increased intracranial hypertension. She was an obese young female, had polycystic ovaries, and very classical patient for a benign intracranial hypertension. So basically, what is the treatment option you can give is the weight reduction, and the patient can be put on Diamox, and serial OCT of the disc can be done to know exactly whether the swelling of the optic disc is coming down or not. So on Diamox, if the patient is responding well and good, no problem. If the patient is not responding to Diamox, then probably we will have to think about an optic and shunts. Case 5, it's basically a left eye painless loss of vision, 624 vision, and superior sectoral disc edema was there. Just 2 more minutes, I'll just complete. Inferior altitudinal field effect, and if you see, there is a sectoral disc edema. And the other eye, you can see a small disc. So your suspicion should be and the fields also showing a typical inferior altitudinal field effect, suggestive of non-arthritic AAON. Another patient, young female, bitemporal hemianopia. You should always think about in terms of pituitary adenoma. So the nasal fibers are involved, and hence you need to you will get a bitemporal hemianopia. MRI and endocrinological workup and neurologist opinion is needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. So here we come up with a question and answer session. We will wind up within 2 minutes and we'll head on to the next session. I hope there are any question answers. You can just proceed right away. Thank you.
So I think there is one question. Is there anyone from the panel from UVI here? There's a question from Dr. Sonali in the question bank. She's asking about hypopia on uveitis. Do we have any panelists from uveitis here? Dr. Tanvi?
Yes.
Yeah, is there anyone from the uveitis panel?
So I guess your voice is really very breaking.
There's no.
I guess there are no questions.
Yeah. So I think we can wind up now. So I would, as a chairperson,
no problem, sir.
I would just thank everyone, all the participants, and especially all. And we can in the next session. Dr. Sonali, don't worry. We'll make sure that question is answered by one of the uveitis panelists later on. Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.
So our next, since we are running ahead of time,
thank you so much.
So we can move on to our next session, Tanvi.
Yeah,
right?
Sure. So once again, I would like to thank the chairpersons and speakers for such an illuminating session, for giving it today.